I want to end on what we know about how various people behave in groups as far as our knowledge of social loafing. And we also then want to transition to kind of a blueprint of how to build teams and things to consider of when and when not to try to focus on teams as a successful solution. So let's first talk about when you've had a group member that worked harder than the rest of the people in the group to ensure group success, not really worked at all, thinking that someone would take up the slack and the group would still complete their goals. This is the intersection of social psychology and personality psychology. So basically looking at how individuals behave differently. Some individuals are predisposed that if the group starts to fail, to take up the slack, to work harder. Some people are inclined, personality wise, to again kind of slack if they're allowed to fade into the background and let the group do the work. So another thing that we want to consider as far as diagnostics and levers when we're looking at groups and organizations and teams and organizations is, have we set up a situation that basically is expecting people to pick up the slack and hoping that they're in that group? And more specifically, have we set up a situation that allows people to slack back? And what that often may look like is if we have two or three people on the team that all have similar skill sets and are in a similar role, that's when we start to have to worry. So if we've got five people, each one is integral to the team's success, each one has to do their job in order to make the team work, you're probably not going to run into this problem. But if you have more people of the similar skill sets, what may very well happen if you're not careful and you're not watching this is you may have someone that starts to just take up the job to get it done, very task focused. But the problem with that is again, we're losing the advantages of having a team of multiple people and a diverse opinion and diverse opinions and diverse viewpoints. Likewise, if we are allowing people and set up a situation that has multiple people with similar skill sets, some people just naturally in that particular situation may just fade to the background and not really work very hard. Neither of these are good outcomes. So let's talk about this in a little more detail. So social loafing is the tendency for group members to exert less individual effort on a group task as the size of the group increases. And this is based on social impact theory. The responsibility of each group member tends to diffuse for doing what is expected within the group. The larger the size of the group, the less each member is influenced by the social forces acting on the group. So we already talked a little bit about as we get to larger and larger groups, it's harder to build cohesion. It's harder to actually get a lot of positive movement going. And it's the same in this case. As we build a larger group, we're probably going to start to see repetitive skills, and we're also going to start to see situations that allow people to socially loaf. Now, some people are more inclined towards social loafing, but all of us are susceptible to this to some degree. You take the most motivated people that are out there and put 20 of them, all with the same skill set, all in one group, probably all of them are going to slack off a little bit. Now, someone may jump up but accept and work even harder, but for the most part, that's what we're worried about. So again, when we're creating a team, we want to make sure we're creating a team that encourages individuals to be responsible for what they're doing. We don't want that team too small that the skills that are necessary to do the task aren't there, but we also don't want to overload the team with too many people. We're increasing the chance of social loafing at that point. So generally, as the group size gets larger, the likelihood of individual effort goes down. And we find this in most people. Now, again, it may vary by the individual. We might find a high performer is still a high performer in a large group, but they're not quite as high as if they were in a much smaller group. So we find this tendency across all people, but especially people that are tending to put in moderate effort to begin with are extremely susceptible to, if they're allowed, to do as little as possible to get by. And this increases with group size. So it's another thing to consider when creating work groups and teams. So social loafing is a little bit of a Western concept. Many times I've talked about whether or not a particular finding of how humans behave is cross-cultural or not. Basically, it's not necessarily a Western concept, but we do find social loafing is more likely in individualistic cultures, national groups whose members place a high value on individual accomplishment and personal success. For example, the United States of America. So in this case, we're more likely to see social loafing because there's a high value on individual accomplishment and personal success, but there's also a desire to tie our work to individual accomplishments and personal success. And the larger the group is, also the less likely that we will individually be identified for such personal success. In collectivistic cultures, national groups whose members place a high value on shared responsibility and the collective good of all, an example of this would be China, are cultures where, again, we will find social loafing exists, but it'll exist at a much lower level. There's a stronger cultural component that basically suggests that this is not the way to behave. So again, social loafing does not occur as frequently in collectivistic cultures, but it is not eradicated in such cultures. It's something that we still want to look for. So let's transition to how do we create high performance teams? Teams whose members are deeply committed to one another's personal growth and success, and within an organization, specifically organizational goals. So some characteristics of high performing teams. People are free to make their own decisions without checking with others. In other words, there's a fair amount of not ambiguity, but there's a fair amount of ownership and empowerment in people's decision making. Everyone on the team shares responsibility to some degree. All members agree on what they're trying to accomplish and clearly are focused on the goals. And everyone cares about results, and the members coordinate the individual talents to achieve them. So you can kind of notice that the definitions of a high performance team are fairly similar to when we were talking about what we find with a highly cohesive team. And we also can see that some of the steps that we would take for cohesion will also result in higher performance teams. And what I mean by that again is if management is creating a team, we want to think about how do we create that team in a way that people are empowered to make their own decisions. We want to make sure that we set up that team in a way that everyone shares the responsibility of the success or failure of the team. We also want to make sure that there's clear agreement in the team on what the goals are and how to achieve them. And we also then effectively want to make sure that everyone cares about those results and are strongly oriented on succeeding in those results. When we find these traits, we find high performance teams, and high performance teams tend to outperform non-high performing teams. But also, a lot of these traits are things that we can start thinking about how do we set them up, whether we are a manager creating a team or even if we're in a team. What can you do if you're in a team to help make sure that these things are being seen to and are being aligned in such a way that the team is more likely to perform well? So, the advantages of a team: groups and teams have more information than individuals do. And really, when we're talking about advantages, we want to make sure that we are managing and utilizing these talents. So one of the advantages of having a group or a team is that a collective of people do have more information than one individual would have. But we also need to make sure they're sharing that information, they're communicating that information, and they're allowing the team to work with all of the information. Groups and teams tend to simulate human creativity, especially when they're set up in such a way that people feel empowered. You remember what you discussed, especially if you don't have expertise. So there's a better understanding of everyone on the team, even of areas that they aren't necessarily involved with. You are more likely to be satisfied with the decisions you make. So you usually find people that are on successful performing teams also have higher job satisfaction. And to some degree, you also gain better understanding of yourself through social facilitation and through the interactions you have with others. So again, if we're looking at purely the bottom line, organizations have a lot of reasons to look for situations that align well with team formation, to manage teams well, and to make sure that teams are functioning, because there's a lot of positive outcomes that you get when you have a team. Some of the disadvantages of teams and things we need to look out for: group members may pressure others to conform to a majority opinion. In other words, there can be that idea of groupthink, where you're no longer getting the advantage of a diversity of opinions because certain group members are making sure everyone just quietly agrees. Individual group or team members may dominate this discussion, again, kind of halting this process. Some group members may rely too much on others to get the job done. So again, social loafing, especially on larger teams. And working with others in groups or teams takes longer than working alone. And that is a disadvantage of all teams. If you're needing something done very, very quickly, a decision needs to be made, and a single person may have the expertise to do it, if speed alone and time factor alone is a factor, a team might not be the best way to go. Not only do we have to think about the formation of a team, especially if a team is need to be created for this crisis point. So again, going back to Tuckerman's model of the 5 stages, we've got a fair amount of work to do before we ever actually get to performing. But if we've got some time, then definitely this disadvantage can be mitigated. It does take a little bit longer to get good work done, but studies have found the work is usually of higher quality, the decisions are usually more successful, and more options have usually been thought of, assuming the group has not fallen into the trap of groupthink. There are some times when not to collaborate. So when the group or team has limited time, when an expert already has the answer, when the information is readily available from research sources, or when there's unmanageable conflict is present. So there are some times where if you're looking at an organization either as management or an external consultant, where a team would not be an appropriate response. So again, I already talked about the time problem. If it is it's a crisis decision, a team might not be the best solution. Also, if the answer is not really requiring that much innovation or does not need a lot of examination. In other words, if there's someone that already really knows what's going on, has a background in the overall area of the problem, that might actually result in just as good of an answer. Also, one of the advantages of teams is you have a diverse group of people that are looking into gathering information and gathering resources about trying to come up with a good solution. If that information is readily available, again, one of the advantages of a team might be reduced. And finally, we do need to be aware that there are interpersonal differences and individual differences in people on a team, and sometimes there's just unmanageable conflict, and that team is never necessarily going to succeed in that current form. Um, Generally speaking, when I'm diagnosing a team as an organizational psychologist, it's rare that I fall back on the team itself needs to be disbanded, but it needs to be an open window to that thought. It occasionally is a situation where this team is not manageable in its current form. Usually it's because it's either been so locked into kind of a groupthink leadership cycle, or there's certain members that have that informal influence or power that are constantly warring for control of the group. Those would both be situations where it might be better to just separate them and restart. So individually, what can you do to become a competent group member? A competent group member is someone who can interact appropriately and effectively with other groups and teams. That's pretty straightforward. Research by Michael Mayer found that the two most important behaviors on a team were fully participating in the discussion, so being willing to share your ideas and be an active participant in the group, but also offering encouraging and supporting comments to others. So you can look at your own behavior in groups. Am I operating in a way that is helping us effectively get to our goals? Am I operating in a way that allows us to communicate to other groups and teams? And am I also participating in the discussion, sharing my ideas while encouraging others to do the same? All of those will result in a more successful, high-performing team. Another thing to think about when we're kind of talking about competent group members is also recognizing that a part of a group's strength is identifying information that's needed. And this is often defined as unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. So unconscious incompetence means that you don't know and you don't know that you don't know. In other words, there's some information or resources that are critical to the decision that's being made, and you're not even aware that that information is missing. Conscious incompetence means simply that you don't have the information, but you at least know that you need to get the information. Conscious competence is you have the information, you know the information, and you've gathered the information. And finally, unconscious competence is what we often refer to as mastery. Not only do you have the information, you know it backwards and forwards, and you're an expert in that field. So again, trying to kind of doing a thought exercise with groups of, okay, what do we know, what do we don't know, and what do we need to know? This kind of, by the way, this way of looking at the world was one of the things that actually got one of our political leaders, whether you agreed with him or not, into a little bit of trouble because he was referring to this model when he said there's known knowns, there are things that we know, there are known unknowns. That is to say, there's things we know we don't know, but there's also unknown unknowns. Those are the things we don't know we don't know. And that sounds a little confusing, but it's that same idea. We need to know what we don't know. We need to know what we know, but we also need to figure out what do we not know that we don't even know that we don't know. Those are all parts of a team, and it's much easier to do that as a group. It's one of the main strengths of a team is that ability to gather information, the ability to extrapolate from a lot of different sources to come up with better decisions. So hopefully all of this has given you a little bit of thought of the own groups and teams you're in, how to potentially think about how organizational psychology can inform us how to build better teams, but also how to diagnose a team when it has problems and how to serve as a personal individual member of a team in a better way. So as always, if you have any questions, reach out on Canvas. The discussion board, I'll be checking that daily. And thank you again for listening to this lecture, and I'll talk to you next week.